It's finally time to put the heart back in this beast. I know it seems like it was never gonna happen, but the day is finally here. So putting this thing together, even as an amateur, there have been very few red flags that make me concerned that something's not going to be perfect. But one of those red flags that we have had is the top crankcase cover right here was not able to tighten down all the way. Now I know BMWs leak oil, and most people think this is a feature, not a flaw. But I know this is gonna leak oil because it wasn't able to torque it down. The threads are stripped. So before we finish buttoning up the entire engine and putting it back in the car, I figure why not try to fix our oil leak problem and actually repair those threads on the aluminum head. So I'm gonna pull this housing off here. We're gonna pull the top crankcase cover off, and we're gonna try to fix these threads. Now, like I've said before, I'm not a professional mechanic. I don't know how this is gonna go, but first we have to take everything off, starting with the thermostat housing here, and then the distributor, the rotor, and then our distributor key, and then this inner cover comes off, just the front crankcase cover. Use a little piece of wood, kind of knock it out of place and pull it off. Then what we need to do is go ahead and drill out that hole a little bit, make sure it's all cleaned up. And of course I'm trying to keep stuff out of the engine, and the first time I did this I probably didn't do the most fantastic job. So what I did was go ahead and dip that drill bit in grease, and this tends to hold on to all of the shavings. And I finished drilling it out. Then I just tap it to a slightly larger size. And this seems to torque down just fine this time around. Next we've got the valve cover. We'll go ahead and put that on there. Then we'll put our distributor back together. There is just one more thing that I need to take care of. I also want to remove the O2 sensor before I put the engine in, while it's a bit easier to get to. So this O2 sensor just was not budging. So what I did was I just used a grinder with a cutting wheel on it, and I just cut the whole end off with the cable. Once we did that, I went ahead and sprayed it down with some WD-40. Maybe that'll loosen it up a little bit. Hit it with a couple heavy-duty Ugga-Duggas, and our O2 sensor popped right out. This thing also needs a new thermostat, so let's get it in there. I spent a pretty good amount of time cleaning up this thermostat housing, using the same method I used to clean up a lot of other surfaces. First we go in there with our razor blade and clean it all off. And we're going to clean off the engine side of the surface as well. Use some wire brushes and a little bit of sandpaper. And now it's time to put our thermostat in there. And this is kind of tricky because you have a rubber O-ring, and then you have the thermostat, and then of course you have the gasket. You got to kind of hold everything in there all at the same time as you tighten it up. The time is now. Let's put that engine back in the car. So my brother's helping me put this engine in because I feel like it's definitely safer with 2 people, but also I had a slight shoulder injury at the time that was impeding me from really doing a lot of heavy lifting. So the first thing we did is remove the engine from the engine stand. Then we attached the flywheel cover to the bottom of the engine, and this will protect the flywheel from all kinds of road debris and junk and garbage. Then we put in our central bearing and just used a socket and a light taps with the hammer to seat that in there properly. And it's time to put on the flywheel, and there's really only way to put this on there. It is keyed, so you just get it stuck on. There is a metal ring that goes on it after that, and then you just bolt it on there. And we're going to use Loctite on all of these bolts just to make sure that they're not coming out. Hand tighten them down in that specific cross pattern. And then we're going to go ahead and hit these all with the torque wrench to make sure they are all torqued to the proper specifications. Now we have the clutch, and our clutch has this nifty centering tool which made it pretty easy. So we just center that up on there and then put the housing on top of it, line the bolt holes up. And hand tightened all those in there real quick. A ratchet just to make sure they were all on there pretty good. And it's good to use a cross pattern when tightening these down as well, just to make sure that it's completely flat against the flywheel. Now we just arranged the engine up over our engine bay, moved everything out of the way, and slowly but surely began to lower this thing down into its final resting place. This can be fidgety, it can be really dangerous. If you're going to do this, try to do it with a friend. And also make sure that you keep in mind that if the engine rests on your hand and gets pushed against something that isn't going to move, it's distinctly possible that you could lose fingers, crush fingers. There's all kinds of things that can possibly go wrong. So when you do this, just be sure that you do it as safely as you possibly can. Take your time and go slow. Now at this point I had taken the motor mount brackets off so that we could lower it into place and try to push it onto the transmission. And that's kind of what we're doing right here. We're just pushing it to try to seat it to the transmission. We're using a jack on the transmission to try to kind of line it up correctly with the engine. And once we get it kind of seated on the transmission, all we have to do is go ahead and put on all the clamps for the motor mounts and bolt them on so that the engine is properly seated in its little hole. using the hoist and the floor jacks and everything else to move stuff around to get all these bolts in place so that the engine mounts were all properly set up, and then of course torque those down to their proper torque specifications. We need to get the exhaust hooked up too. I would like to get the passenger side of this engine buttoned up today, and in order to do that we need to get the exhaust manifolds on right down here. Now they're all new studs, they should go on pretty easily. This shouldn't be a problem, but these are disconnected and connected at the same time, which means they operate semi-independently of one another, and unfortunately they don't seem to want to work together. So what I'm going to try to do is tilt the engine a little more so these are facing down a little more and in the right spot, and see if I can't get them to line up easier so I don't have to muscle them all in. So after tilting the engine over, I used some pry bars and things like that to pull the headers up and push them onto these studs, and all I really needed to do was get a little bit of purchase on one or two of these studs and we were home. The next thing I had to do was just kind of put all the nuts on and tighten them down. Some of the ones underneath are a little bit more difficult to get to, but at this point adrenaline is pumping and you're in the home stretch, so it wasn't that big a deal. Just a few transmission bolts left. These are really tough to reach. Now some of these transmission bolts are really easy to get to, but some of them are quite difficult. So you have to use all kinds of ratchet extensions and you have to put all kinds of crazy bends in your arm, and you're definitely going to be sore after you do this. But just keep in mind that you're not doing this every day. Just take your time, understand that it's not going to happen in 5 minutes, and work every bolt until it's properly tightened on there. I'm pretty sure if I had to do this job every day, tightening up a transmission on an engine, I would come up with a much better way to mount the transmission so that I could actually get to these bolts. But when you only have to do it once every 5 or 10 years, it's really not something you have to worry about. You just have to figure out how to devise tools and extensions to get a bolt on them. And once you do that, then it's just a matter of tightening them on there. I can't believe the engine is finally back in. I sure hope it's gonna run. All that's left is the wiring and the cooling system. How hard could that be? Famous last words, right? Why am I spending all of this time and money on this 733 that's not worth anything? It could only be for the love of cars. And I've never done any of this stuff before. But if this moron can figure it out, I know you can too. So find your dream ride that may need some work, pick it up and put it back on the road. And I'll see you in the next one.